Judge Grayson thought he was dealing with just another clueless teenager, a kid who wouldn't even understand the charges he was facing. Little did he know Jalen Dawson was far from clueless. As the young man stood beside the defendant's table in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. The gallery was packed with spectators, murmuring amongst themselves, some curious, others certain they knew how this trial would unfold. Jalen stood tall, hands casually stuffed in his pockets, his chin slightly raised, an air of quiet confidence emanating from him. He was only 19, but this wasn't his first time in a courtroom. He wasn't some scared teenager facing a grand theft auto charge and resisting arrest. No, Jalen Dawson was a force to be reckoned with. The charges against him were serious grand theft auto and resisting arrest, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear that the judge wasn't taking him seriously. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily on the polished wood of his desk, eyes narrowing behind the rim of his glasses. He was clearly mocking the young defendant. With a smirk curling on his lips, Grayson spoke in a voice laced with dry amusement. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His tone was sharp, almost condescending. "This isn't a debate club, kid." The gallery responded with a few chuckles, and the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor joined in on the joke. They all shared a laugh, sure that this teenager would buckle under the pressure of the courtroom. But Jalen didn't flinch. In fact, he wasn't laughing with them at all. He was too focused. For years, he had studied law in the shadows, reading case files and memorizing laws. His friends may have been playing video games or memorizing sports stats, but Jalen had spent his time studying the ins and outs of legal battles. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen had absorbed everything he could from her. He had heard about how prosecutors sometimes bent the truth, how judges favored certain sides, and how defense attorneys could fall asleep during their cases. He knew this system. He understood it better than most, and he wasn't about to let it beat him. Despite the judge's attempt to belittle him, Jalen knew that none of this mattered to Grayson. To the judge, Jalen was just another kid in trouble, another face in the system, but that would soon change. "Let's make this quick," Grayson sighed as he flipped open the case file, his eyes already on the clock. "I've got a golf game at 2. A few people in the gallery chuckled again, but this time, something in the room shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a subtle smirk, but it wasn't out of amusement. No, it was because Judge Grayson had just made his first mistake. The judge had underestimated Jalen, and Jalen knew it. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the kind of confidence that only comes when you think you've already won. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted just right, and his voice carried the rehearsed, practiced cadence of someone who had delivered the same speech time and time again. He was a seasoned prosecutor, used to getting his way. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle at 2022. Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest," Carrington said, his voice unwavering. "Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The gallery shifted again, their whispers growing louder as they processed the information. On the surface, it seemed like an open and shut case. A stolen car, a high-speed chase, a defendant caught in the act. But Jalen wasn't worried. He wasn't afraid of this so-called evidence. He had seen this all before. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on," he muttered, clearly ready to wrap this up quickly. Carrington strutted toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance. Carrington said, his eyes locking with Jalen's for the first time. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? The tension in the room was palpable now. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand as he observed Jalen closely. Jalen, however, didn't blink. His eyes remained locked on Carrington, unwavering, as the prosecutor continued. Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The case seemed to be building to a close, and the evidence was stacking up against Jalen. The stolen car, the high-speed chase, the arrest. It was a clear-cut case, or so it seemed. But Jalen had spent years studying trials, analyzing every detail. He knew better than to accept what was being presented as fact without questioning it. Grayson exhaled, rubbing his nose. Sounds straightforward to me. He looked at the prosecutor and nodded, clearly preparing to move on. For most of the room, this was it. The case seemed settled, but Jalen saw the cracks. He stayed silent, watching, waiting. Finally, the judge tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response, he said, turning toward Jalen's public defender, Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since she entered the courtroom. She was clearly nervous, shifting in her seat, her hands trembling. She stood up, her voice barely audible. Your Honor, she began, but Jalen placed a hand on her arm, silently asking her to stop. He didn't need her help anymore. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor, Jalen said, his voice calm, steady, and clear. The room went completely silent. Every head turned in surprise, and Judge Grayson stared at Jalen, clearly taken aback. You'll what? Grayson asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Jalen didn't back down. His voice remained firm. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff raised his eyebrows in shock, and even Carrington's confident smirk faltered for a moment before he burst out laughing. This should be interesting, he said, as if dismissing Jalen as a naive teenager who didn't know what he was doing. But there was no laughter when Jalen stepped forward, his presence in the room suddenly commanding attention. Everything was about to change. Jalen let the silence stretch out just a little longer, making everyone uncomfortable. Then he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms, clearly impatient. Go ahead. Jalen stepped forward slowly, his eyes never leaving Carrington's. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? He asked. Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored with the line of questioning. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report. Jalen nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward the judge. Of course it is, he said. Then he turned back to the judge, his voice calm but filled with authority. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at him. On what grounds? Jalen took his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Carrington's face flickered with confusion. What are you talking about? Jalen didn't back down. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. He let the words hang in the air, building the suspense. I have a feeling it won't. The gallery buzzed with whispers now. Grayson's expression hardened, and he glanced toward Carrington, his frown deepening. Carrington, his jaw tightening, cleared his throat. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen gave a small shrug, his demeanor casual but his eyes burning with intensity. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, the room was still. The judge studied Jalen for a long moment, then turned back to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated, the silence stretching out far too long. The pause was enough for the jury to notice, enough for the gallery to notice, and enough for Grayson to notice. Finally, Carrington shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. The shift had begun. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. It was silent, but the tension was deafening. Carrington quickly shuffled his papers, trying to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small, unreadable nod. That's true, he said. Then he stepped forward again, his eyes locking with those of the jury. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. Jalen turned to the jury, his gaze moving from person to person as if drawing them in. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a deep breath, his tone measured and calm. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, and then you put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? Jalen paused, letting the question hang in the air. Some jurors exchanged glances, and someone in the gallery murmured something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside 11 hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. But I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. It was just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let the words sink in for a moment before delivering the final blow. Does touching something make you a criminal? The courtroom went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Carrington cleared his throat loudly, flipping through his notes with growing frustration. He was trying to find something, anything that could turn the tide back in his favor. Jalen wasn't done yet, though. No, he wasn't even close to finished. Now, while we're on the topic, Jalen said, his voice smooth, unwavering, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned toward Judge Grayson, his eyes sharp with focus. Your Honor was the forensic specialist from this case, subpoenaed to testify. The courtroom fell into a hush. Judge Grayson blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington, who, for the first time, seemed a bit uncertain. The prosecutor hesitated, shifting in his seat, before finally answering. Number Jalen's lips pressed together as he processed the answer, his expression unreadable. So let me get this straight, he continued, his tone calm but filled with intent. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis? The words landed like a punch, and Carrington's jaw tightened, his frustration barely masked. Jalen simply nodded as though everything had clicked into place. Interesting, he muttered, making sure the entire courtroom felt the weight of his words. Judge Grayson let out a slow, almost reluctant sigh, rubbing his temple as if he'd just realized this case wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. He had expected a quick win, a tidy conviction. But Jalen wasn't playing by the rules Grayson had assumed. Jalen wasn't finished yet. He stood a little taller, stepping forward with an air of quiet confidence, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? He asked, clearly caught off guard by the shift in momentum. Jalen nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. He turned his gaze toward Carrington, locking eyes with him in a silent challenge. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers? the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's face went rigid. His jaw clenched, and it was clear he knew exactly what was coming. Jalen wasn't giving him a chance to weasel out of this one. Without waiting for Carrington to answer, Jalen reached into his folder and pulled out a printed transcript, holding it up for the courtroom to see. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station," he began to read aloud, his voice crisp and clear. "Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The impact of those words hit like a slap. Jalen held the paper up high, letting everyone in the room see it. "That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned," he added, his voice dripping with disdain. He turned back to Judge Grayson, making sure to maintain eye contact. The arresting officer admitted this in his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. "And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" Carrington, now visibly rattled, stepped forward, his posture stiff, his face flushed. He tried to regain control, but it was slipping from his grasp. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant," he blurted, his voice tight. "The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Jalen shook his head, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "No, I wasn't," he said, each word precise, deliberate. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." The words hung in the air like smoke, and the room fell into stunned silence. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple again, the weight of the case pressing down on him. It was unraveling, and he knew it. He couldn't deny it any longer. Jalen turned toward the jury, his gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with each of them. "The real suspect got away that night," he said, his voice soft but powerful. "The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." The silence in the room deepened, suffocating. The jury seemed almost frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he broke the silence, his voice low. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington was visibly sweating now, his face flushed, his composure cracking at the edges. "No, Your Honor," he said, barely above a whisper. Judge Grayson exhaled deeply, his eyes flickering from Jalen to the jury. After a long pause, he finally leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence followed. The room held in the moment as everyone processed the words that had just been spoken. And then chaos erupted. Half the courtroom exploded into disbelief, while the other half seemed to exhale in quiet relief. The gallery was a whirlwind of whispers, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, voices rising, phones flashing. But Jalen didn't move right away. He stood still, letting the moment stretch out, allowing the weight of what had just happened to sink in. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, stared at Jalen. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady. There was something different in his eyes now. Recognition. Maybe even regret. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the world he thought he knew, the system he thought he understood, had been exposed. Jalen met Grayson's gaze, standing tall, unflinching. And then, without saying another word, he turned and began to walk toward the door. But just as he reached the threshold, the judge's voice called out, "Mr. Dawson," Grayson said, his tone a little softer now. Jalen stopped but didn't turn around. He wasn't going to give Grayson the satisfaction of a response. Not yet. Grayson hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly on the gavel. "You should consider law school," he said, the words almost like an afterthought. Jalen smirked, a hint of amusement creeping into his eyes. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with noise. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing like a storm of light, microphones thrust forward as if they were weapons, all eager to get a word from the young man who had just outsmarted the entire justice system. Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? The reporters yelled. But Jalen didn't acknowledge them. He pulled his hoodie over his head and continued walking, shutting out the spectacle. This wasn't about him showing off or proving how smart he was. No, this was about something much bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, stood waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him, her expression tense. And then, finally, she let out a breath and shook her head. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head, a little sheepish now. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him a second longer, her gaze softening, before pulling him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one, she muttered, and Jalen could hear the love, the pride, even in her words. The cameras continued flashing, but he wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched the scene unfold. His posture had changed, no longer the confident, superior stance of a man who thought he had everything under control. No, his shoulders were slumped a little, and his face wore a look of contemplation, reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day in the courtroom, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he would remember this one. Because Jalen had done something most people could never do, he made the system take a long, hard look at itself. And for once, the system blinked first. There's a lesson to be learned here, isn't there? How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted, not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, or a system more concerned with closing cases than with finding the truth? Jalen had the knowledge, the insight, and the courage to fight back. But what about the ones who don't? This case wasn't just about one kid, one trial. It was about the entire system, the flaws and the cracks that people too often ignore. Jalen knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. No, next time, he'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. What Jalen did in that courtroom is a powerful reminder of how crucial it is to challenge the system when it fails you. His bravery and intelligence weren't just about winning his case. They were about confronting the deep flaws that run through the criminal justice system. We all know the system isn't perfect, but too often people stay silent, afraid to question it, especially when they feel like they have no power. Jalen's story shows us that we can fight back even when the odds are stacked against us. It's heartbreaking how the system can sometimes prioritize convenience over truth, how biases slip into decisions, how shortcuts become the norm, and how people can be judged based on assumptions rather than facts. The fact that a simple, overlooked piece of evidence could change everything speaks volumes about how much we take for granted. Jalen made the system face its flaws, and he did it with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any gavel or formal ruling ever could. In the bigger picture, it's not just about one trial or one case. It's about the millions of people who don't have the luxury of Jalen's knowledge or the courage to speak out. How many people are wrongfully convicted or caught up in a system that doesn't care to dig deeper, to question, to listen? His story is a call to action for all of us. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to demand answers, and to make sure the truth is heard. We all deserve that chance.